I found your book a bit sort of worrying and slightly depressing, because one of the points that you make very forcibly is that as human beings we are strangely resistant to being convinced by data or facts, and in fact when we are given facts that don't accord with our predispositions, we twist them and misuse them until they do. Now, why is this?
Yeah. So I'll tell you why it is, but I just want to say before that what I am saying, I'm not saying that science or facts are not important. They're very important to find the truth. They're just not enough to convey the truth. And they're also very useful to change people's minds when they don't have a very strong opinion or when they have a generally worldview that's similar. It's when you're trying to argue with someone who has a very strong different view that it's not enough. And the reason that it's not enough is actually quite a rational one. The brain assesses a piece of evidence in light of the knowledge that it already stores, because that is in fact the correct approach. Often when I hear something that contradicts a belief that I have very strongly, that piece of evidence on average is wrong. So if I were to tell you now that I saw a pink elephant flying in the sky, you would assume that I'm delusional or I'm lying, as you should.
Or had a very, very good morning.
had something for breakfast.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's 4 factors that determine whether I'm going to change my belief, which is my current belief, my confidence in my current belief. The more confident I am, the more less likely I am to change it. The new piece of evidence and the confidence in that piece of evidence. And the further away the piece of evidence is from my current belief, the less likely it is to change it. And there is one exception, though, and that exception is when that piece of evidence doesn't fit to what I want to what I believe, but it fits to what I want to believe.
Now, before I'm going to bring Rob Riemann in just a second. Before we do, there's one very good anecdote at the beginning of the book which kind of explains what the problem is, where candidate Donald Trump, I think, is debating with an American scientist about whether the MMR vaccine causes autism, and the scientist knows the truth. He has all the facts at his fingertips, and Trump absolutely hammers him in this debate. Just tell us a little bit about what happened.
Yes, right. So this is the debate between Ben Carson, Dr. Ben Carson, and Donald Trump. And one of the things that they were debating was a link between autism and vaccines. Yeah. And so Ben Carson, a pediatric neurosurgeon, was giving all the data and the facts, suggesting that there isn't a link between the two. Donald Trump, on the other hand, was giving a story. One of his employees had a young baby, and that young baby went to get a vaccine. And it was all, the story was very vivid. There was a horse-sized syringe that went into the small baby. A few weeks later, he became very, very ill. When Ben Carson was trying to convince Donald Trump, he said, in his word, he said about Donald Trump, he is an intelligent man. He should read the facts, and he would probably change his mind. But of course, that was very naive of Ben Carson. But what
People
I found...
remembered the horse-sized syringe and the little baby and the baby getting ill, and that's what stuck in their minds, not the data.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, I was watching that, and I myself had my young son was 8 weeks old at the time, and I found myself quite affected by this story.
And you're a neuroscientist.
I'm a neuroscientist. I know the data. And I myself became anxious and stressed, thinking, well, maybe I shouldn't vaccinate my kid. So, of course, at the end, I did. But the power of a story and the power of raising emotion in someone, it's, we shouldn't take that lightly. It's very powerful.
Rob Riemann.
And I loved her book. And I think it's I was not impressed. I think it's a very important, and I hope it will be a very influential book because I also had my Trump moment, probably the same time when this debate with Carson. When I wrote my essay on the eternal return of fascism in 2010, I was slammed by all academics and politicians in my country. I couldn't care less because that's how those people are. In the meantime, 8 years later, there is Trump, there is Orban, all those fascists are now popping up everywhere. But there was one thing I could not understand in studying this return of fascism. I had read Thomas Mann, I read Camus, I had read my great hero Nietzsche, sorry Steve, but one thing I could not understand is how was it possible that in those 20s and in the 30s, millions and millions and millions of people believed in Mussolini, believed in Hitler. There was a holy faith in those people. And with Trump, I suddenly saw it's this power of charisma. It's this power of charisma. And what was the big mistake of Hillary Clinton? Data. I mean,
yes, she had all the facts.
Yes, she had all the facts. And nobody's interested in these things. Yeah. Of course not. So this returns to my point that we need a different kind of education.
And as part of that different kind of education, educate us about the amygdala and the hippocampus and the relationship between those two very important parts of the brain? Because that seems to me to be a key part of your story.
Well, in trying to explain why when there's something emotional, why is that so effective? Well, one reason is that emotion, first of all, grabs your attention. Right? And for good reason. If someone comes in with a gun, you should attend to that gun and not to anything else, right? So that's one thing that happens. If you're telling me a story, it's quite emotional, I'm going to attend to you and what you're saying. That's one thing. The second thing is I'm more likely to remember it. So
and the amygdala is a very small, very old part deep in the brain, which basically has all the chemicals that drive the emotional responses. Yeah.
Right. So we have two amygdalas, one on each side, and they're about the size of a cherry tomato each, and they're important for processing emotion. And whenever something emotional happens, they're activated. And one thing that happens is that the amygdala talks to a region that's just next door called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is really important for memory, and so when something emotional happens, our memories become
quickly
stronger,
etched,
and so
yes.
we're more likely to remember something that's emotional as well. So that's another reason. And again, this is not irrational. Emotion is there for a very good reason. Emotion is there, it's a signal. It tells us this is important. We should probably listen. We should probably remember, right? It helps us survive.
What do you say to those people who read the book and think this is a good example of why, in some respects, mankind can't progress, because good arguments are not always going to crowd out bad arguments? We have emotional responses. If the bad arguments have the more vivid anecdotes, drive an emotional response more quickly, then people will be voting for Mussolini, whatever it might be.
So ironically, I think that this is an example where science can win, because science tells us about how the human mind works, right? What it is, what are our biases, what are we likely to believe, what kind of mistakes are we likely to make. And by knowing that, we could actually use that to make progress, right? And not to fall into these mistakes like Ben Carson did, which is just using, for example, facts without the
glossy and vivid around it. Stephen Pinker, fellow neuroscientist, what do you make of this?
I think that is an excellent statement of one of the core principles of the Enlightenment. All of the Enlightenment thinkers were sophisticated amateur psychologists. We might call them even neuroscientists. But they identified a number of limitations in human cognition, tried to develop workarounds, and clearly we have made progress in circumventing a lot of fallacies and biases. People don't believe in unicorns anymore. If a ship sinks, they don't find a witch to blame it on. We don't engage in human sacrifice and throw a virgin into a volcano to get better weather. And in fact, both Talia and I cite the work of the Yale legal scholar Daniel Kahan, points at another source of irrationality, and perhaps the major one, which is that when certain beliefs become identity badges for coalitions, when to be a good member of your community, you profess a particular belief, that's when you get all of these biases in their strongest possible form. And that is certainly true of issues like climate change and evolution, where belief does not correlate with scientific literacy, but rather with right versus left political orientation. And even with the bogus claim that vaccines cause autism, it is part of a moralistic narrative in which a medical establishment is
trying to do something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In fact, what Kahan points out is for the vast majority of scientific beliefs, they're not politicized. People aren't particularly irrational. No one defends drunk driving. No one says that antibiotics don't work. No one says that.
So eventually, the message gets through.
Well, if the beliefs are dissociated from your tribal identity. And that is what is a crucial way of debiasing. And Talia writes about the fact that there are debiasing programs. They're of varying effectiveness. But having identified the flaws in cognition, then we could at least target them in our educational system.
And so here we all are sitting around trying to influence each other and people listening to the show. I'm very interested in another aspect of your book, Talia, which is about the hit you get, the dopamine hit you get from simply trying to we are wired to want to persuade other people. There's been very, very interesting experiments, for instance, on Twitter, and the hit you get when you start to try to communicate with people on Twitter or Facebook or other social media.
Oh, right. Well, actually, this is a study from Harvard University where they found that people actually, well, I mean, it's not surprising, they enjoy telling people about their knowledge. They enjoy sharing their opinions. They enjoy it so much.
But not just a little bit, a lot.
They enjoy it so much.
Yeah.
They're willing to pay for it. And the interesting thing is that the opinions that they were sharing were not political opinions. It was things like, is coffee better than tea? Even something like that they found
Okay.
enjoyable and were willing to pay for it. And you're right. In their imaging study, the reward center in the brain was activated when they were able to share their opinions with others. And so that drives us to share, which is a good thing, because otherwise we would die with our knowledge, right?
We do want to share, but there's a little warning I'm going to read out from your book to all those people who may be keen to tweet about the program at the moment. If you're an avid Twitter user, you say, beware. Tweeting is one of the most emotionally arousing activities you're likely to engage in on most days. Forget exercise. Studies show that tweeting raises your pulse, makes you sweat, and enlarges your pupils, all indicators of arousal. It's extraordinary.
Right. Well, I think the thing about Twitter, it has all the characteristics of what Daniel Kahneman talks about, fast thinking, right? So your message has to be short. Usually you react really fast. You read something, you react to it, and it goes broadly. It's very social. So there's all this influence. We're influencing others. Others are influencing us. And I think that there is a danger to that, right? Because we don't really have often time to inhibit ourselves.
Yeah, well, I mean, the most powerful Twitterer on the planet is now Mr. Donald Trump, and it's very effective and it's extremely dangerous, and there should be one good reason not to Twitter, and to go back to, the world of philosophy and the quest for wisdom. I know these are very old-fashioned notions, but the real progress will be made by these notions.
Do you